Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Caitlin and I upload 3 times a week on this channel. Wednesdays are fashion and lifestyle videos, Fridays are weekly uni vlogs of my life at university, and Sundays are Unsolved Sundays where I discuss some sort of unsolved disappearance mystery case, anything along those lines, and that is what I'm bringing to you today. So today I'm going to be discussing the case of the Oklahoma Girl Scout murders. This is absolutely heartbreaking. There is basically just 3 young girls were murdered on their trip away at summer camp. So if you want to hear a little bit about the case and some of the evidence and things, then keep on watching and we shall just get started. I would just like to point out very quickly, if you are new here, this isn't my usual setup. I've come home from university for Easter, so yeah, different background. It's going to be here for a couple of weeks while I just am home. I'm going to film a few videos, so that's why things might look a little bit different for a while. But yes, let's get started with the case. So on June 13th, 1977, 3 young girls arrived in Camp Scott. It's a Girl Scout camp in Mayes County, Oklahoma. 3 young girls we're going to be talking about today in this case. Their names were Lori Lee Farmer, who was only 8 years old, Michelle Heather Guse, I think, or Guse, she was around 9 years old, and Doris Denise Milner, who was only 10 years old at this time. They were all strangers to each other before this day. They'd never met, and this was the first time meeting when they'd met in Oklahoma in Camp Scott, and they were assigned to the same tent together. At around 6 p.m. that day, the 3 girls entered their tent. They were in tent number 8. They took shelter from an oncoming storm. There was a huge storm that was going on that night, so the 3 young girls took shelter from the storm. The way the Camp Scott was laid out, there were kind of groupings of like tents. So there were tent number 8 sort of their group, and their particular group was the most isolated. It was all spread out amongst this sort of campground, and theirs was kind of the furthest away, and it was a little bit more out of the way, so it couldn't necessarily be seen from the main counsellor's cabin. So it was obviously still within the campgrounds, but it was a little bit further out than the other groups. The last activity known of the girls was when they went into their tent that evening to shelter from the storm, and then it wasn't until around 6 a.m. the next day when a counsellor decided to get up. She was heading towards the showers, so she was walking across the campsite. As she was walking through the grounds on the campsite, she discovered the bodies of the 3 young girls. Lori, Michelle and Doris had all been brutally beaten, and eventually they discovered that they had also been sexually assaulted. The 2 youngest girls, Lori and Michelle, had both been bludgeoned to death with a blunt object, while Doris, the oldest, had actually been strangled. And as I said, before their death, they had been sexually assaulted. The bodies had been found in a sleeping bag, so whoever had committed this crime stuffed their bodies in a sleeping bag or their sleeping bag, and then just left on a trail around 150 yards from the tent that they'd been sharing that night. There was blood all over tent number 8's wooden floor, suggesting that someone had been at least injured there, and it appeared as though whoever had done this had also attempted or started to attempt to wash up the blood but hadn't done so properly. Just outside the tent they found a military boot bloody footprint, and this was later sort of tested and things, so I'll get onto that a little bit later. And then also outside they found a roll of duct tape, women's sunglasses and the case of the sunglasses, as well as a flashlight that had a piece of plastic film over the lens with a hole poked in it. On closer inspection of the bodies of the 3 young girls, they discovered that one of them had been missing one of their shoes, and this is very, very strange because the other girls had their shoes on, so one of the girls only had one shoe on. And then later on in the investigation, bearing in mind all the law enforcement officials or the authorities had taken up camp in Camp Scott while they were looking for clues, the missing shoe just one day appeared in Camp Scott. Like, no one saw who left it there, no one knows where it came from, but the missing shoe was returned to Camp Scott and no one knows how or who did it. So it was eventually determined through the investigation that Lori and Michelle had both been killed inside tent number 8, while the eldest, Doris, had been dragged out into the woods where she was later killed there. There were a number of counsellors and other Girl Scouts that night who were in the campsite, claimed they heard like really strange noises throughout the night, but bearing in mind the setting they were in the middle of the woods surrounded by loads and loads of young girls, and also there was a storm going on. So I think you have to remember, sort of as I go through some of these strange noises and claims, that in that situation you're very likely to sort of brush things off and have other explanations as to what these noises were. You wouldn't automatically assume that 3 young girls were unfortunately being murdered. So one, I think she was a Girl Scout, I don't know if she was a Girl Scout or a counsellor actually, but she claimed she heard a loud noise that was something sounding like a loud frog or like a bullhorn. So there was no evidence as to what that is. One scout said that she heard faint crying and a scream. Again, bearing in mind the storm, you're surrounded by young girls, so I think it is likely that a lot of these sort of brushed it off as homesick girls or scared girls of the storm, so it didn't necessarily seem something like super scary at the time. Another camper at the time said that at some point in the night she was woken up by a shadowy figure who opened her tent and shone a flashlight directly at her and then left again. But this was a little bit strange at first, but it was later disproven, and it's believed to be just a counsellor who did hear some strange noises and she decided to go around and check on some of the girls. So yeah, that's what that is. That was, I think, disregarded as being anything too strange. So that night, when some of the older counsellors had heard these strange noises, they'd actually seen earlier that day, before that first day of camp, some strange men lurking around the campsite. So they were themselves were a little bit cautious, and they decided to go check on the young girls and have a look around in the middle of the night to see what sort of these strange noises were, more so just to tell the girls to like quieten down, go to bed, because I think a lot of them figured it was just the groups of young girls making noise. The counsellor decided to walk around, and I believe the one that shone the flashlight and the young girl says she didn't find anything out of the ordinary, and she decided to go to bed. There was also a few people who claimed to see a bright, strange, like orange light just shining at some point during the night and then just disappearing. So again, no idea what that could be. The day after the bodies were found, immediately Camp Scott was evacuated, and it has never been reopened since. It is now a popular site for a lot of like paranormal enthusiasts, ghost hunters and things, because a lot of people believe that the spirits of the 3 young girls who were murdered there actually haunt the grounds. I don't know how reliable this is, but apparently there's a few sort of like discussions and things online if you want to have a look into that, if you're interested in more like the paranormal side of things. In the 1980s, the camp was sold on to new owners who, once they bought it, it seems they didn't really do anything with it. They kind of just left it how it is. Nothing new was built on it, nothing was knocked down. And to this day, there is still some remaining pieces of Camp Scott there. There's a picnic table, there's a couple of like wooden tent bases, there's a couple of things there that are all like obviously rotting away and things, but there are still pieces of Camp Scott on the campground today. One very, very strange and ridiculous thing that I'd like to point out, I say ridiculous, I mean it's ridiculous that the authorities actually thought that they should do this. I don't know whether it was intentional or not, but it's something that they really messed up on, and that Michelle, one of the victims' parents, actually came forward and said that they had never been told how their daughter had died. So they claimed that the authorities had intentionally withheld information from them. So they said they actually found out through like newspapers and media outlets just what happened to their daughter and the other 2 girls, and that they'd simply been told by authorities that their daughter had been involved in some kind of accident, which is absolutely ridiculous on behalf of the law enforcement team that were involved in the case. I think that's crazy that they withheld that information. During the investigation into the camp and who could have possibly done this, investigators found out that just 2 months before this incident, before the murders of the 3 young girls, there'd been a training session that had been held in Camp Scott on the campgrounds. On the last weekend of this training session, the counsellor's cabin had actually been broken into and ransacked. So the people who carried out this sort of like burglary and breaking and entering had actually left a note inside an empty donut box inside the cabin. So on the note it said, "We are on a mission to kill 3 girls in tent 1. Obviously this was very alarming, and then also to go along with that, counsellors found an effigy of a man had been hung from a tree. Initially they were very concerned by in particular the note and the effigy, but then kind of on closer inspection of the note there was a little bit more that was written, and I think they mentioned some very strange things like Martians and things. So eventually I believe that they chose to kind of just dismiss it as a very distasteful prank, because it just seemed like kind of gibberish apart from the threat. It just didn't seem realistic that it was a threat. So now moving on to the actual main suspect, and there's a lot of discussion on this. Some people are very adamant that he did do it, and others are very adamant that he had nothing to do with it. So there's a lot of information here. Let me know, as always, if I've missed anything, if you know maybe your opinions down below. Always welcome to discussions in the comments. Quite early on in the investigation, while they were looking for suspects, authorities found, or what they believed to be, I don't know how obviously strong it is, but they linked a convict, an escaped convict who was loose in Mays County at the time. His name was Gene Leroy Hart. So he was a Cherokee native. I believe he was, there was a lot of family of his in the area, and he'd initially been sent to prison for the kidnapping of 2 pregnant women and I believe the rape of one of those women as well. In 1973 he'd escaped police custody, and for those 4 years before the murder of the 3 young girls, he had been missing. Police had no idea where he was. They believed that there was some evidence there to potentially link the 2 cases. I read a source that actually said there was a single hair found on one of the victims that had been tested, and it was found to belong to a Native American. So I think that was kind of one of the things that suspected him. Again, like I said, there's a lot of speculation of how reliable this is, so, you know, all opinions welcome here. But when he became like a popular suspect, they conducted an extensive search of the area surrounding campgrounds. There's like a huge area, so they just kind of were looking for any sort of sign, anyone, let alone him in particular. It was a very deep forest area. There was a lot of hills and caves and things, so they had a lot to search. They actually had like sniffer dogs come in, there was a very strange thing with sniffer dogs, how I think all but one of them had died. That's very strange. There's a little bit of like something that people believe there was a curse put on the dogs, so read up on that if you want to. That's quite interesting. So in one of the caves, they actually found a couple of belongings that they now believe belonged to Jean Leroy Hart. So there was a photo of 2 young women that they eventually linked, I believe, maybe to be the 2 women that he was convicted of kidnapping, but I don't know. But there was 2 young women there, and there was also a few other belongings that were believed to belong to him. There was also a note found scribbled on one of the cave walls, and it just said 77-6-17, the killer was here, bye Falls, which is very strange. And it wasn't until someone actually sent an anonymous tip to the police of where he would be hiding that they discovered him. So on April the 6th, 1978, police were sent to a cabin in Cherokee County where they discovered he'd been hiding out. It was a very small cabin. It wasn't very nice at all. He'd obviously just been in hiding for the last 4 years, and they arrested him. So due to this strong belief of him being the main suspect, he was sent to trial for the murders of the 3 young girls, but he was deemed not guilty for insufficient evidence, but he did eventually go back into police custody for his original crime, so at least he was incarcerated eventually. When he returned to prison, he actually died in 1979 in prison of a heart attack. He'd been working out, I think he'd been on a run, and he died of a heart attack. So we'll never know now if he was actually the one who perpetrated this act or these murders, but yeah, that's what happened to the main suspect. So the flashlight that I said was found outside the camp number 8. There was I think it was a thumbprint that was found on it, and they tested it and it didn't match DNA that belonged to Hart, so they don't know what went on there. The bloody footprint was also too small to belong to Hart as well. He was an 11.5, I believe, and I think the footprint outside the tent was a 9.5. So again, another piece of evidence suggesting that it wasn't Hart that perpetrated this. But like I said, there are a lot of people that do think that he was the one who did it, and it might be possible that he wasn't just acting alone. In 2008, the case was revived, and they decided to do some like more updated modern DNA testing on a few of the pieces of evidence that was found sort of nearby the scene. In particular, they tested a pillowcase that wasn't found very far from the bodies of the 3 young girls. So the DNA that was provided from the pillowcase, they were able to determine that it hadn't come from 2 of the 3 victims. They couldn't fully rule out the 3rd victim, so they don't know whether the DNA belonged to someone else, but they couldn't fully conclude that it wasn't belonging to one of the victims. However, whether it did or it didn't belong to the 3rd victim, either way it was female DNA. So that raised a lot of questions as to whether or not there may have been a female at the scene, hence the women's sunglasses. There's a couple of kind of pointers that people believe point to a female being involved in the crime. So I have a quote here from Laurie's mother, and she says, "I've always felt in my gut that there was a girl present. Given the DNA results, you have to wonder if there wasn't also a female who took part in the murders." As well as this, there was a patch of semen found on a pillowcase that they decided to test as well. The test actually came up inconclusive, so they couldn't fully determine that Hart wasn't the source of this, but also it could be someone else. I think there was an issue as well where a lot of Hart's family members were claiming that it couldn't have been him because he had a vasectomy, but when I think it may have been after he died that they discovered that the vasectomy had not actually been successful, so it still could have been him. But like I said, the DNA tests were inconclusive, so they couldn't rule out anyone in this point. When they revived the case in 2008, they did decide to attempt to test the DNA again on the semen, but once again the test was inconclusive. So yeah, still a lot of unanswered questions there. There's another potential theory here. I don't know how credible it is, but I'm just going to talk about it anyway because it's something out there. So in 1989, a man named Reverend Gerald Manley actually came forward and said that he had been contacted by 4 men who claimed that they needed his Christian guidance. He followed the 4 men to Camp Scott, where he saw, I believe, the bodies of one of the young girls and 2 sleeping bags that he now believed to contain the other two bodies. So Manley's claims were actually proven by a lie detector test. He passed a lie detector test, and also he was put under a hypnosis technique, and he said exactly the same thing. So it appeared like he either was telling the truth or he genuinely believed that he was telling the truth. He managed to provide authorities with the names of 2 of the men that he was contacted by and not the other 2, but I don't think anything came of that. I believe that they may have maybe looked into them and not necessarily been able to find any strong links to be able to convict them. So one prominent point that is kind of quite likely that needs to be considered is the likelihood that it is more than one person that perpetrated this act, because a lot of people are saying that since it was 3 young girls and it was obviously, as much as their camping area was a little bit more sort of remote and isolated, there were still other girls around and there were still people patrolling and things. So in all likelihood, for one person to be able to murder and assault 3 young girls without alarming anyone, without them making any noise, or without one of them at least getting away, it seems very unlikely. So I personally believe that it's likely that more than one person involved. I don't know whether there was likely to be a woman at the scene. I don't know about her. I have very mixed opinions about that because, like I said, there's a lot of insufficient evidence and there's a lot of sort of mixed evidence. So let me know down below what you think about that and whether there's a particular theory that you think might be more realistic. So yeah, that's everything I'm going to discuss in today's video. As always, let me know down below sort of your opinions, anything I've missed, anything that you want to discuss. I love it when you guys kind of have discussions amongst the comments. I've always found that interesting. I definitely always read through them. And also let me know down below if there's any case that you want me to look into and do in future weeks' videos. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys found this interesting, and I'll see you guys soon for another video. Bye.